Let me see if she can join as well.
Okay.
Let me see if she. Okay, let's make a quick start. I think when others join, we'll take them on. So today we are looking at covering what is called the learning outcome 4, and this learning outcome 4 is going to be focused on understanding the how do we conduct risk analysis. So risk analysis in terms of organizational risk analysis, and it could be at 3 different levels: tactical, operational, and strategic. And what we need to be able to do is look at primarily understanding how do we look at doing a risk assessment, and then how do we plan and get around in terms of managing the risk if the organization is to face those. Now, risk can be of different types. These risks. So these risks can be tactical, operational, and strategic. So when we talk about types of risks, what we are looking at essentially is talking about various types of risk which the organizations can face. And these risks could be financial risk, it could be operational risk, it could be risks which are related to, say, for example, external factors, inflation, exchange rate fluctuations. It could be risks which are related to compliance, which could be things, for example, regulation and legislation like minimum wage, or, for example, working time directive, or in some cases, companies when they employ workers primarily on, say, visas, it could be compliance-related risks. And then when we talk about, operational risk, it could be risks related to, breakdown of equipment, breakdown of a process, strikes. And these could be operational risks which could be specific to the organization. So in this particular learning outcome, we're going to be looking at how do we conduct a strategic risk analysis on the operations function of an organization. Now, we are not too keen on, we would basically go through bits in terms of understanding the different types of risks, but the main focus is primarily going to be on operational risks. We are not going to be looking at going into detail on financial risk, compliance risk, regulatory risk, or risks which could be strategic risks, things like competitor activity, introduction of new products by competitor, price drop. They are all different forms of risks which the organization can face. But here we are going to be focused on, understanding what are basically operational risks, and how do we get to basically look at controlling some of these operational risks. Now, operational risks can be of 4 different types, and that is what we are going to look at in the learning outcomes indicative content. Now, these 4 types of risks can be related to people, processes, systems, and any sort of external events. So these are risks which are basically going to be specific to the organization, and these risks then are further categorized into tactical, operational, and strategic. But we are focused on just basically looking at operational risks, simply because the unit that we are studying is principles of operations management, and the idea there is that any uncertainty or hazards which a company can face when conducting daily activities have to be looked at and have to be mitigated, have to be anticipated, and then obviously mitigated. And that is what we are going to be looking at covering in this learning outcome, which is conducting strategic risk analysis on the operations function of an organization. Now, as always, I've got a presentation that we'll go through. I've got some slides which will cover all the indicative content, which is predominantly in this learning outcome 4. And it is divided into 3 broad categories or parts. One is risk analysis and management. The second is risk, managing uncertainties and potential risks. And the third is basically looking at, stakeholder analysis and expectation. So here, what we are going to be able to do is we're going to basically look at, the 3 different categories that we are going to look at of risks, and these would be, looking at operational, tactical, and strategic. Now, let's get into by understanding, some of the key terms that are going to repeat again and again when we discuss, obviously, this particular learning outcome. Now, one of the things that is going to come across quite frequently is risk. So when we talk about risks, in terms of meaning of risk, in business in particular, or risk in general, what we are essentially looking at is that it could be, essentially talking about the situation which could expose the business to some sort of uncertainty or danger. And that would be the basic textbook definition of risk. But when we talk about risk in terms of the business facing the risk, it could be a business or an organization which is basically exposed to uncertainties, and these uncertainties can be created by events which are beyond the control of the organization. Events, for example, say the breakout of Ukraine war, for example, that is a risk which nobody anticipated, and obviously that has impacted industries all across. Now, that risk is something which the business or businesses, not just in Ukraine, but businesses outside in other countries in Europe, across the globe, have also had effects in terms of exposure to the war, and obviously that has impacted operations in some cases very adversely for some organizations, and these operations can have adverse effect on the company's working, which is essentially operations. It could have effects on the financial health, and it could also create or potentially create threats for the organization in terms of continuity of business, or also looking at for example some sort of stability in terms of how the business stable environment in terms of how the business would operate. So business risks can be categorized into various different forms. They could be market risk, financial risk, operational risk, and strategic risk. We are going to be focused on, as I mentioned, operational risks, and these risks are risks which are predominantly going to originate from people, processes, systems, and some external events which could be, for example, affecting the organization from outside. Now, Examples of operational risks, very easy to understand if you know what we are talking about, because we're looking at people, processes, systems. So when we talk about a strike in the company, a union action, a balloting, which is typically done for strike, or unions when they do balloting, that could be a risk which is related to people, and that is an operational risk because that will bring the activities of the company to a standstill. You talk about processes, for example, if you talk about a process risk, it is going to be related to, for example, a machinery breaking down, or in some cases, a process or policy not being followed, leading to a different outcome. And that again is going to be a process related link. Systems risk could be if the IT systems, for example, or any sort of machinery, critical equipment which is related to or is going to help the users or people work within the organization. For example, if your network is down or Wi-Fi is down or the PC breaks down, these are going to be risks which are related to systems. If it is a manufacturing concern, then a breaking down of the machinery because of wear and tear or not proper maintenance being done in terms of maintaining the machinery, those could be termed as systems risk. Systems risk could also be classified as risks which primarily could be in some cases down to gaps in operational areas. For example, the operations manager or the person is new and they have not been able to anticipate a problem that could arise or an issue that could arise, and that could be part human and part system related error, and that would also create system risks. When we talk about external events could be events which are basically uncontrollable events. For example, if act of God, as we say, earthquake, fire, these things, if they happen, they are uncontrollable events. If we look at unintentional fraud or intentional fraud, this is an external event. You have hacking into the website of an organization, that could be an external event. And these are basically areas which are going to affect the business from outside. And when we talk about these, they would be termed or categorized as what are called external events that would create operational risks within the organization. Now, let's look at, in terms of how would you carry out the process of doing risk analysis? How do we identify these risks? So one of the things that we look at is when we talk about identification of risks, the first thing is you need to identify what the problem is or what the issue is. And that leads us to basically start getting into what is causing the problem, the actual reason of the problem, and how is it being caused. So that would lead to essentially called identification of process, wherein you try and go in and identify why is this happening, or what is the process which is having this outcome, which is not a desired outcome, and that is what would be risk identification. Then at some stage you look at assessment, which means you'll be looking at in terms of probability and what could be the potential impact if it goes unnoticed or unresolved, or we don't look at doing or taking any action against it. Then what could be the potential impact that it could have on the output? Then we look at quantification. Quantification could be done in terms of financial terms. For example, sometimes you would see manufacturing companies look at some sort of waste being produced, or let's say byproducts being produced. Now, these byproducts sometimes do not have any implications in terms of the operations of the business because they are not having any financial impact. But if any byproduct or any waste which is being produced, say for example, also has a financial implication, that means they cannot do away with that waste, and in order to treat it, the company is looking at spending more money on it, or in terms of resources on it, then in those cases, quantification of risk is to be done. Now, if, for example, the company does not have, say, for example, any sort of liability insurance, and if an accident is to occur, that could create a financial risk for the organization because it could lead to a liable lawsuit. The employees and the families of the employees, for example, filing a liable lawsuit, and in this case, it could be a financial risk. So having a complete liability policy would be ensuring that the company is covered if there was an accident, or accidents are, if it was an accident to happen, and if it leads to any sort of loss of life or critical injuries, then quantification would mean that this would be covered through the employer's liability policy, which the company has. And then one of the key roles of the operations manager or somebody who's a risk manager in the organization, depending on the size and scale of operation, is to look at how do they look at mitigating this risk. That means when we talk about mitigating, what we are looking at is in terms of understanding how do we avoid this particular risk, or how do we do away with this particular risk, or what is it that what is it in terms of action that needs to be taken in order to ensure that this does not happen again. So mitigation tends to be a process wherein we are essentially looking at reducing the loss, or reducing or transferring the loss which could happen or which could affect the operations of an organization. And that would be risk mitigation and the management of managing that risk so that it does not cause harmful, unpleasant, or something bad in terms of the operational aspects to the organization or people involved in that organization, would be called the risk process of risk management. And then sometimes in certain professions, in certain sectors, the risk has to be monitored. There is a continuous probability of the organization facing risk from people, processes, systems, or external events. And obviously in those cases, what needs to happen is that you need to be able to monitor and continuously keep a tab on what is where the risk could occur. And if it is to occur, then the monitoring aspect of it allows it to be adjusted and negated or done away with. So risk assessment follows a 5-step process, and we will look at this in a bit more detail in the subsequent slides. But because today's learning outcome is all about risk analysis and risk management and uncertainties or potential threats, and what we want to be able to do is make sure that the definition of risk is clear. What is risk analysis? What is risk management? And we are aware of this in terms of ensuring that the organization has a backup plan in case if this is to in case certain factors, which are people, processes, systems, or external events, are to disrupt business activities, then in those cases, risk side of things or risk management side of things tend to be, people in managing those would tend to step in. Now, there is a particular video that, obviously you can watch, and this video is about risk analysis and how businesses face risk. I'm not going to be playing that video on this session is because of the copyright issues, but here the link to that particular video has been put in. And this is a good video which summarizes why businesses need to have a risk manager, or why businesses need to look at their operational side of things in much more detail as the scaling up of as businesses become global, or they have operations in multiple sites. Then management of risk, mitigation of risk, and monitoring of risk becomes very important. So this video gives a good insight in about 2 minutes in terms of what is risk analysis and how it can be conducted within the organization. Now let's look at any questions. Please feel free to ask me. Because there is lots to discuss in this learning outcome. So anything that you don't understand, feel free to raise questions. Now, what we are looking at is primarily, looking at understanding how do we conduct risk analysis, and why is it that we need to break it into 3 categories like operational, tactical, and strategic. Now, when we talk about risk analysis, the reason why we need to look at breaking it down into 3 different levels is simply because when we look at, identifying a problem or an issue, what we need to be able to do is also identify where the problem is happening or where the problem is actually occurring. And when we look at the occurrence of that problem, we are then looking at risks being identified at 3 levels. And the reason of identifying these risks at 3 levels tend to be so that appropriate people, resources, and processes can be applied to basically manage that particular situation. So a risk analysis, can be an approach which will allow let's say people at different levels to be able to get a comprehensive understanding of how risks can be overcome or how they can be avoided in some cases. Now, when we talk about these 3 different types of risks, what we are looking at is sometimes you would generally see that there are problems which do occur, and these problems would then be required to be solved at different levels. And that could also be one of the reasons why we need to categorize these risks. So things that you encounter on a day-to-day basis or during the day-to-day working of your responsibilities would be termed as, operational risks. Things which are related to, let's say, some sort of gap areas between operational, working and long-term vision of the company, they would be termed as, or looked at from a tactical area. So if we need to say, for example, if the sales are falling for an organization, then at some stage production needs to be ramped up. But if the production cannot be decreased, then at some stage, what the organization would look at is, should we look at decreasing prices in the market in order to make sure that there is no, in order to make sure that there is no inventory pile up happening, at our end. So, and these are risks which the company would take, and they would be defined as tactical risks. One of the examples that I would give right now is when you look at the iPhone 15 coming out, at some stage, the organization Apple decides that, we know that there's an imminent new product announcement which is going to happen in September. What they start doing is they start looking at the inventory, they start looking at the production lines, they start looking at how do we decrease or look at managing the requirements in terms of demand side for the iPhone 14, iPhone 14 Pro, or some of the other models, because when the new model comes out, everybody would want to buy the new model, and any inventory or any excess inventory in the case of the new model being announced would then become difficult to be sold to customers. So in this case, the organization takes a balanced approach or a calculated approach to start reducing the price of the previous models when the new model is introduced. So, and then starts looking at diverting some of the manufacturing capabilities towards the new phone, and then looks at a staggered release of these phones across different countries. So this is an example of how the company would look at mitigating risk in terms of inventory pileup or non-selling products, by looking at taking a tactical decision on decreasing prices and decreasing the manufacturing of the older models when the new model is announced. And then when we look at strategic level, strategic risks tend to be an analysis of very high level risks that can impact long-term viability of the business or the organization. So if there is no new model, for example, Apple introduces for a couple of years, and then the older models that they have, when I say older, for example, if there was no announcement of iPhone 15, and it would have left a gap in terms of that the company is probably not able to innovate or not able to bring out new models or new features, or it is failing to read the demand and understand the pulse of what the customer expectations are. So in those cases, if there is a lot of gap in the introduction of newer model or variants of the iPhone in the market, that would start impacting the revenues of the organization, the profitability of the organization, and that would be termed as a strategic risk, because the product engineering side of things is not able to come up with newer models which could be launched in the market, and they would then create what is called a strategic risk, and that would be basically dependent on the fact that the market is moving ahead, but the company is not being able to move ahead because of the fact that it has no newer products to introduce. And in those cases, they would be termed as strategic risks. Now, when we look at them in a bit more detail, what I've done is I've classified these risks into three different types. First one being operational, and here, if we look at operational risks, we need to understand two different, models. One of them is basically the transaction cost economics. Now, this particular model was introduced by Williamson, and this particular framework, essentially looks at basically, looking at the various costs which the company incurs while conducting its transactions. So the transaction cost economics is a concept introduced by Williamson in 1979, and is basically rooted in the fact that the company needs to start looking at costs which it is incurring in terms of either processing or production or engineering, and how these costs can actually impact the final output in terms of products and services that it sells to customers. So here, The costs as per the model, when we look at, are three different types. There are search and information costs, there are negotiation and bargaining costs, there are contractual or legal costs, and last but not the least, there are monitoring supervision costs, which this model takes into account for the purposes of ensuring that the organization remains competitive and is able to then still bring out products in the market which are in demand and able to sell those products to its customers. Any costs which are incurred in terms of buying, selling of goods and services, or in terms of production, for example, labor cost or material cost, would all be a part and parcel of the cost of the product. And then on top of it, the company puts its profits and then looks at selling it to the customers in the market. Now, why is this model important in terms of operational costs? Because all companies are looking at making profits. And when we look at companies looking at making profits, they need to be able to organize themselves as per the market, or say, for example, organize themselves with various structures, depending on which market it operates in, what are the various requirements with regards to competition, customers' expectation, and then looking at with what resources will it manufacture these products. And in manufacturing these products, the organization has to consider things like efficiency, productivity, and also looking into areas that are going to be related to expenses it incurs for manufacturing these goods and services before they are sold to distributors, retailers, or end customers in the market. And that is where the company is essentially looking at minimizing the excess costs in order to increase its profits as far as the working is concerned. And because this is something which happens on a daily basis as a routine during the production of goods and services, that is why it is classified as the operational level, or at the operational level. And these costs sometimes, say for example, can lead to let's say, I'll put it this way, let's say increase in expenses in certain cases and decrease of profitability in certain cases on certain days. So a typical example of this would be if you imagine that we are looking at an organization which is predominantly manufacturing goods. Now, if there is a breakdown in the line which happens, then the operational managers have an option to look at asking and immediately asking for support, and obviously bringing the best engineers in to be able to look at the machine and then make it up and running, or solve that problem. Now, if they think that it could be it is a smaller problem which keeps occurring, and then what they look at is a quick fix, then the machine can break down again sometime during the course of the day or in another shift, and that will again lead to disruption. Now, the operational decision here which the manager would need to look at is, if there's a part which has undergone a lot of wear and tear and that needs replacement, they would need to basically order that part and we either wait if the machine cannot work, or in some cases make it work by using or repairing the part, but also order a newer part, so that once that comes in, that gives it a new life in terms of running without any breakdowns or defect for a longer period of time. Now, that is where the operational risk or the operation manager will be looking at calculating the risk in terms of what is the cost of ordering this new part, and is there a guarantee that even after replacement of these few parts which are required, the machine will still keep providing the same efficiency in the output in terms when it is run during the shifts. And in some cases, that would mean the operation managers would even do a risk assessment to see if the machine is probably 10 years old, it has come to the end of its life, then they would need to start budgeting beforehand in order to ensure that there is a cost for replacement which can be managed. And the process through which this replacement of machine would happen is because you place a supplier order to the supplier, they might have a lead time of 6 months. By the time the machine comes, they have to keep it running. And that is where you would look at regular maintenance being done in order to ensure that the machinery does not break down till the time a new replacement is in place to be able to run it. And that would be looking at, just as an example, operational cost. Now, if we relate this to an example of people processes, people would be, if there is a lot of absenteeism with regards to workers taking holiday, or if this is going unnoticed, this would be an operational cost because or a risk at the operations level, because the production manager or the shift manager has to then start looking at recruiting or replacing employees which are showing or taking more leave than usual, and that would be affecting the operations at the manufacturing level. Is that okay? Now,
yes, sir.
We also look at, say, for example, the second model that we are going to look at in terms of, operational risks is the process-based model of operational risk. Now, this process-based model of operational risk essentially, is something which primarily was also introduced, and this particular model looks at identifying risks from a point of view of the organization operating within, say, the financial sector. Now, this model is specifically related to, say, the financial system, but again, it helps in identification of any sort of operational risks within financial services type of organizations. Now, this model is focused on improving and looking at basically improving various processes within the organization, which allows it to reduce the likelihood of any errors, inefficiencies, or disruptions that can happen because of financial losses or any sort of reputational damage. Now, assuming if Apple is to introduce a new product and this new product fails to create any traction with the customers and the sale of this product actually start dropping, then in those cases, what Apple would need to do is basically anticipate that this is happening, and in those cases would need to start putting things into action to either look at a newer announcement of the product in a shorter period of time, and simultaneously would need to start warning or give out some sort of warnings to look at giving projections essentially, and those projections would be essential warnings for any sort of anticipated financial loss in that quarter, because the product is no longer selling or is no longer selling as anticipated, and that is why the company would need to look at maybe the company might have a dent in its sales and profitability for a quarter or so, or 1 or 2 quarters, and that would mean it will suffer reputational damage. It could have financial losses, and that would need to be budgeted in from a point of view of looking at how the company would do course correction of this operational risk, which is the model not creating traction with customers, and would need to look at it from a point of view of different things like increasing promotions, decreasing the price, including offers, or coming out with aggressive offers like buyback or trade in your old phone, and in some cases even a price drop, in order to ensure that the model starts creating attraction with the customers. Now, this process of process-based model of operational risk obviously follows certain key steps, as in what we've discussed when we talk about risk analysis and the process of identification of risk. So it goes through that same process of looking at identification, assessment, measurement. Then we look at mitigation, and then continuous monitoring to see whether this is having an effect or is further changes required. And in those cases, monitoring as a process would be useful. Now, the reason why this model has become very important is when we look at businesses which are very well established, and they use various methodologies that we talked about, like continuous improvement, total quality management, or for example Six Sigma or lean management, and some of the other processes which we looked at, things like statistical process control or business process reengineering. Then in those cases, the process-based model of operational risk is essentially supported by these frameworks, and it becomes important for the organization to look at managing any sort of risks that it feels can come out of the operational activities of the organization. And in order to better manage these risks, they have to then employ or basically employ the process-based model of operational risks to isolate risks which are affecting or creating adverse events for the organization, and then look at stabilizing the operations of the organization. And that is where this particular model comes in quite handy. Now, when we look at tactical risks, what we are looking at essentially here is tactical risks, which are basically, going to be related to resources. And in general, if you recall the RBV theory that we discussed, and when these type of tactical risks have to be looked at from an organizational point of view, what we are basically going to see is that the organization would essentially look at again doing say some sort of analysis to understand why these risks are happening within a particular process, or if they are related to a particular way in let's say a particular system within the organization, and how their nature of risks can be essentially mitigated by looking at testing, or maybe ensuring that they are tested before when, say, for example, in this case, companies, when they look at bringing out new products. So Apple, for example, when it looked at, maybe the internal decision would have been taken 6-8 months earlier, and they had decided that these are the new features which are going to be introduced on the product. There would have been some sort of internal testing of the product which would have been done, and this would have looked at taking feedback from internal users or different stakeholders to see what could be the changes that they are required to make in order to ensure that the product comes out and becomes a success. So in some cases, some of these tactical risks, which could encompass a wide range of factors depending on the context, would basically be would be looked at by the management. And in some cases, these risks which are looking at, if I look at the history of Apple typically looks at working in competing teams. There would have been 3 or 4 models which would have been the let's say the intended replacement model for the iPhone 14 Pro or iPhone 14. These teams would have been competing against each other to highlight differences and advantages of the product and the material that are being used in the product. And at some stage, the management then sits down and takes a decision that this product or this particular variant of the product would need to be taken forward. And the other teams then obviously start going back to the drawing board again to start looking at further product innovations which could be done on what is being introduced. So in this case, they look at following a particular methodology in terms of looking at customers' expectation, their position against competitors in the market, and then start putting a process in place which would allow risks to be looked at, and try and reduce risks which in the medium term could be affecting the organization in general. Now, the last level of risk that we talk about is, strategic risks. Now, these risks would be because of geopolitical uncertainty. It could be because of situations which are sometimes beyond the control of the organization and can affect not just the organization, but all the other types of organizations operating within a particular sector. Now, the likelihood of the company facing this kind of a risk tends to be quite low in most cases, because of the fact that they are basically in control of people, systems, and processes. Only the external events or external, events which are beyond the control of the organization could basically pose this long-term threat to the, organization or its products and services. But if this kind of a risk is to occur, then the impact of this risk tends to be quite high. If you look at companies like Nokia, BlackBerry, some of the keypad-based, phone makers failed to anticipate that touchpad-based phones would become, would be posing a serious threat. And at someday they would basically be looking at driving the consumer experience side of things. And because they failed to anticipate that shift or that drastic shift which was happening, and they failed to contemplate and anticipate that if they don't make changes now or introduce models or competitive offerings, the companies whole existence would be threatened. So we look at these companies have now become Nokia, for example, has stopped manufacturing phones. It does manufacture phones, but in a very small way, and they've got marginalized because they did not analyze some of these risks, which were strategic or long-term in nature, and they failed to anticipate the threat from the competition, and that is where this can be a strategic level risk for organizations. And Nokia, if you look at, has gone into more of infrastructure towards telecom side through Nokia networks, rather than now only being reliant on producing the phone, or the whole ecosystem that they own, the Symbian operating system, and obviously before the introduction of the iPhone, or some of the touchpad-based phones from Samsung, iPhone, and Apple and others, they were the largest manufacturer of phones in the world, mobile phones in the world. So in summary, when we look at these type of risks, it is important for the organization to understand what level this risk is going to be, whether it's going to be operational, tactical, or strategic. What are the various strategies that they need to employ in order to mitigate or avoid these risks? And then the risk analysis has to be thorough through that 5-step process, and continuous monitoring and control has to be done in order to ensure that these risks do not occur or reoccur in the future, thereby impacting the operations of the organization. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? Now, we also look at risks, and when we look at risk avoidance matrix, this is a particular matrix wherein you can do 4 things with risks. Either you can avoid them, reduce them, transfer them, or accept them. And the risk assessment matrix or risk mitigation matrix typically talks about these 4 different ways through which organizations can actually do away with risks. Now, they tend to be risk avoidance, reduction, transfer, and acceptance. Now, these are various strategies which the companies need to employ in order to do away with risk, or in order to basically manage the risk. Now, risk avoidance tends to be when the company wants to eliminate the risk altogether. That means they will proactively be seeking and monitoring activities of the say process or manufacturing or engineering or whatever the organization into in terms of services. They will be anticipating these risks which will occur, and what they will do is take proactive steps or actions to basically eliminate this risk altogether. Risk reduction tends to be when we look at there is a likelihood or high likelihood of the risk occurring, and in this case, what they would do is imminent safety measures, audits, and inspections would be put into place, which are processes essentially allowing risks to be detected. And then the company has processes or, put action into place to be able to manage these risks or control these risks. And that is where they're going to look at risk reduction. If you're able to manage the risk, you're able to control the output or the whole categorization of how it will impact the product or the services of the company, then in those cases, you're looking at risk reduction because you're able to manage the risk by implementing stricter processes or controls in terms of how the output is being produced. Risk transfer is where the company would look at transferring the risk to another party. That means if you look at insurance contracts, for example, when businesses, sometimes are during COVID, for example, a lot of companies took out financial insurances because if the operations of the company was impacted, because employees were not able to, work and there were lockdowns and they had to work from home, there was a great impact of, productivity going down, efficiency of the organization going down, production of goods or services not happening and coming to a standstill in some cases. Then in those cases, businesses looked at, a risk transfer because they had taken out insurance policies which would allow them to tide over that, period. And that would mean that they'll be able to manage the risks by looking at transferring or shutting down or reducing operations, but covering it through an insurance policy. Then we look at risk acceptance. Sometimes organizations will have to accept that there are risks in which what they do as operations, there are risks involved. And in this case, they have to keep aside costs which are required to basically, manage these risks. So when you look at certain businesses which operate in, say, for example, harsher conditions or weathers, for example, rescue, companies like AAA or roadside, when they work and do these rescues in harsher conditions of snow or, wind or rainy weather, then essentially, these companies are very clear that they are going to be operating with conditions in which there are going to be risks. And what they will need to do is accept that there are certain levels of risks which they will need to build into their operations. And there would be costs that they'll keep aside, training and development, which will be done with staff at system and processes to ensure that they are more equipped and are successfully able to actually manage that risk or look at working with those risks. Now, when we talk about the process of risk management, this basically explains what I've done. So in terms of when we look at process of risk management, what we are looking at is organizations having the 5-step process of identification, assessment, planning, monitoring, and then controlling. And at each step, they put a list of things or a list of processes in place to identify, to assess, to avoid, to control, and to monitor. And in some cases, this whole process is basically called the risk audit process. So most organizations that we work with or know about have, say, for example, a fire alarm fitted within the premises. And this fire alarm is essentially tested, every month or every quarter or every 6 months, depending on what the policy and how the frequency is. But the reason why this is done is because they want to carry out a risk audit to see if the event of a fire or in the event of a fire, what they want to see is how long does it take for the factory to, let's say, how long does it take for the workers to come out of the factory or to, bring the operations to a bit of a standstill because there's a fire risk or for example, there's an additional type of risk which they have done. So these fire drills and these processes or procedures essentially used to conduct fire drills are basically nothing but a risk audit which the company does to ensure and check its readiness. If this is to occur, then what would the company be essentially looking at, and what would be the reaction time, and what would be the time in which they'll be able to, avoid or manage this particular risk. And I've explained that in subsequent slides, just to give with example. For example, if you look at avoiding, an example of that would be a pharmaceutical company deciding not to enter a market wherein there are a lot of regulatory hurdles in terms of government licenses or essentially the product side of things that they will manufacture and market in that particular market. So this could be a risk which the pharmaceutical company is trying to avoid. They don't want to go into a market where there's too much regulation or there is too much control, and they then lose the control in terms of how they would sell, market, manufacture that product in that country. Then we look at reduction, installing, say, for example, fire repression systems, which you see at the airport, in offices, sprinkler water systems that we see at the various installations of that, which we see in various offices, is primarily because in the event of a fire or in the event wherein a fire breaks out, these systems would actually come in quite handy, and they would basically avoid the fire from spreading within the premises, and that would be looking at fire suppression systems to reduce risk of fire. And then we look at example of transfer and accept. Transfer could be a company outsourcing its customer services to mitigate the risk of poor customer management. So here, the company might outsource its call center services to a different company or an expert business, which is primarily going to be looking after dealing with customers, and in this case would allow the company to get on with the operational side of things, but the customer complaint side of things would be outsourced to a company which is apt and very competent in dealing and providing a good customer experience. And then when we look at accept, a startup company is a good example wherein it is accepted that there will be a lot of resources which will be used. the company might not make profits for the first few months or years of operation. And in this case, because it is operating or starting up a new business in a very competitive environment, there are lots of risks which are associated, and that could be wherein we are looking at trade-offs and essentially high rewards, and that would be something wherein the system would be the management would be looking at accepting those risks. People or venture capitalists investing into that particular business would understand that these are the risks. The risks are quite high, but if the business makes it, then obviously the rewards are also going to be quite high, and that is where this particular aspect of accepting the risk tends to be with an example of a startup firm. Any questions on this so far? Now, two or three frameworks that we need to understand, which will help us understand what are risk management benchmarks and frameworks. One of them that we look at in particular is how does the organization look at identifying, assessing, mitigating risks using a risk management system. So ISO 13000 is a prominent international standard now, which is let's say a standard used by organizations which will provide guidelines for risk management. And this standard basically is a comprehensive framework which essentially allows the organizations to look at adopting some of the best practices or best industry practices to be able to manage, mitigate, avoid and transfer risks if they are to face any such problems in terms of operating the business. The other system that we look at is in terms of benchmarking risk management programs. So from time to time, what we are going to see is the organizations essentially look at developing their staff and asking them to attend trainings and developments or training or development programs. And this would be to give them idea and give them experience of how, if they were to face this kind of a risk within the organization, how they would best cope with this particular risk. And this tends to be from a point of view of looking at response time. How quickly are you able to respond to any sort of a potential threat that might disrupt your business activity? And thereby, the idea here would be to look at using benchmarking risk assessment method to be able to identify the risk and then see what is the time to reaction to be able to manage that risk, thereby decreasing any sort of disruption which this risk could bring in the operations of the business, and in some cases avoid accidents which can occur because there are certain safety benchmarks which have been set, and these safety benchmarks would allow people working within those areas to understand that they cannot or should not essentially exceed this particular limit. For example, operational efficiency of a machine, operating it at a particular environment, particular level, and beyond that, the machine would be breaking down, or if it is run for continuous periods, then that would break down. So benchmarks would be essentially created. Now, there are two other frameworks that you are going to look at. One is the Basel III framework of financial institutions, and the other is NIST specific, publication for information security. Now, these are different frameworks which obviously are used, to do basically look at management of risk standards and benchmarks. Now, they are applicable in different industries and sectors. So the financial institutions typically would be following the Basel III framework. And when we look at IT and cybersecurity side of things, what we are going to be looking at is the NIST special publication. And this particular, benchmark essentially would be looking at ensuring the organization's infrastructure conforms to the standards as defined in the, say, for example, the operational areas. So cybersecurity could be one such area wherein, this could be applicable. And we do see, just for information and knowledge purposes, risk management is an important aspect of project management. And within project management, or when we look at, project managers essentially working, they would use certain, theoretical frameworks. And one of them tends to be the PMBOK, which is Project Management Body of Knowledge. And that is another framework which is used by them to look at managing how risks can occur and what threats it would pose, and how they need to be mitigated or challenged in order to avoid bringing the project to a standstill, or costing let's say finance, or costing the organization in terms of finances, additional finances for that project, or delays essentially in the project. And these tools essentially are going to be useful for organizations to manage risk and obviously benchmark against some of these processes to ensure that if these risks are to reoccur in the future, then these risks can be easily managed, avoided, transferred, or accepted and budgeted for, so that the operations of the organization cannot be compromised. Now, we look at basically carrying out, say, for example, a strategic risk analysis with regards to a particular organization, or looking at say, for example, a particular type of basically the application of what we are looking at studying right now would be something that we will need to do. Now, excuse me. So when we talk about strategic risk analysis is basically a systematic and a continuous process for assessing the most significant operational risks the organization can actually face while it is producing, manufacturing, providing services to its customers. Now, in order to manage and discuss this, what we need to be able to look at is a theoretical model, which is normally used in the, in strategic risk management and in the strategic planning processes. And this model, often draws, or was actually, introduced by Kaplan and Mike. And this consists of three particular categories of risks, according to when we apply them from a strategic nature point of view. So these risks tend to be, preventable risks, strategy risks, and external risks. And this is then embedded into what is called the dynamic capability framework, which essentially was proposed by ATHE. And this framework allows, the company to essentially manage strategic risks as a systematic and a continuous process, wherein it can then look at reducing any operational risks in the long run that it could face while producing, manufacturing, or providing services to its customers. So this dynamic capability framework is a concept within strategic management that basically focuses on the firm's ability to be able to adapt and innovate in response to changing external environments. Now, when we talk about strategic risks, if you recall at the start of the session, strategic risks tend to be predominantly long-term. They tend to be related to external aspects or events to the organization, and they could, one, have a low probability of affecting the organization, but the impact of these risks, if the organization is not to change or adapt, could be quite high, or in terms of the impact could be seen as, if I look at the 3-level scale, low, medium, and high, the impact tends to be high. Now, according to Thies and Pisano, who are the two people who basically worked on this framework and introduced this later in the 1990s, they look at they looked at, obviously mentioning as in the framework, that the dynamic capabilities of the firm are the ability of the firm to integrate, build, reconfigure internal and external competencies to address rapidly changing business environment. So these capabilities enable the firm not only to respond to changes, but also proactively shape its environment in which it operates. It could be the competition that it operates with, or in particular market that it operates in. And this is where the dynamic capabilities framework essentially significantly contributes to the understanding of how firms can actually sustain competitive advantage by looking at balancing some of its needs and wants in order to look at dealing with that risk. So here what this framework also mentions is that firms employing this framework should also have a sense of understanding that changes in the environment can happen, and they would be because of different factors. And in some cases, these changes provide opportunities for firms to be able to, transform their business models, both in terms of looking at internal resources and also, external competitors. And this framework can also help the organization remain or stay competitive and innovative, because the markets are nowadays dynamic. And when we look at the global business environment, the global business environment is fast changing, quite dynamic. And sometimes this framework is used by companies to remain competitive, to identify and seek what are the internal sources or resources that they're using and how to best utilize them to become more competitive in the market. So this framework is a valuable framework from a strategic management point of view, because it allows the firm to build the ability to be able to adapt, thrive in a rapidly changing business environment. And there have been extensive studies which have been carried out, and this framework is now very widely accepted in the global markets, because it allows the company to reconfigure its internal and external competencies to address the rapidly changing market environment in which most of the global firms today operate. They follow the same 5 basic principles of risk identification, prioritization, assessment, mitigation, and monitoring and control. And that tends to be the same process that they employ. But in this particular, by employing this particular process, what they're looking at is proactively looking at, adapting to the changes which are happening in the external business environment, by ensuring that their business is competent to be able to deal with some of these changes or changing business environment or external events which are happening, and that allows them to better adapt and their business and business strategies to move forward. Now, an example of this, if I put it this way, looking at the dynamic capabilities framework, a company would be looking at continuously monitoring the market to see how the product, or say, for example, their sales are progressing in the market. Now, in order to see this and have a, let's say a finger in this, they would also need to understand their supply chain model in terms of, is the supplier that they work with only supplying to them, or is it supplying to competition? Is there a risk assessment which has been done for this particular supplier? And what is the likelihood, say, for example, of this supplier defaulting or faltering on, providing supplies in terms of raw material, for example, to this company? So when we look at risk category that the company would need to look at from a dynamic, capabilities framework, they might look at external factors like supply chain. They might look at external factors which are regulatory or legislation. They might look at external factors which are technological. For example, external factors in this could be a cyber attack, regulatory, it could be policy changes from the government, and external factors in this case could be a supplier not able to meet its commitment to provide these goods on time. And they are going to be important for the company, because they will either be looking at delaying the manufacturing of the product within the company, thereby decreasing the product in the market and allowing competition to step into its role. So this particular process of identifying external factors in terms of risk tends to be continuous with organizations, and they will be looking at tipping into the dynamic capabilities framework in order to understand and shape or basically bring their business into shape with regards to the rapidly changing business environment. And by adopting this particular process as a continuous process for doing risk analysis, the organization can effectively assess and manage any sort of significant operational risks, which could be long-term for its, let's say, long-term for its sustainability or its presence in the market. And that is where this process becomes quite important. Now, there are certain tools which we have learned in other units and obviously are aware of, which are predominantly used to look at identifying risks or risk factors. So when we talk about SWOT analysis, we talk about this being used to do an internal audit within the organization so that you can detect or discuss your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities and threats. And that would be used, if I put it this way, that would be used primarily to do internal analysis on the weaknesses or strength areas of the organization. External analysis normally could be done through PESTEL framework, and that would be looking at macro factors or micro factors, as we say. So PESTEL would be looking at macro factors which are external to the organization, and micro tends to be SWOT analysis, which are internal to the organization. So these tools can be used to develop contingency plans and strategies in order to mitigate any risks or negative consequences which are associated with the risks the company is going to face as far as operating in the market. And what I've done is I've put down 2 or 3 slides to explain how PESTEL and SWOT analysis can be used to identify risks for the organization. So very briefly, if we look at PESTEL analysis for contingency planning and some sort of risks which the organization can face, which are from external sources, they could be political risk, economic risk, social risk, or technological risk. But within that, what could be these political risks? It could be regulatory changes, trade tariffs being introduced, like Britain exited Europe. So Brexit meant that there were certain trade tariffs and regulations which were put in place while dealing with Europe and European Union. If you look at economic risk, it led to a bit of a downturn in the market, economic output going down slightly. And sometimes when you look at inflation increasing, that also tends to impact the gross domestic product or GDP of the country. We look at social risks, which could be related to not understanding consumer behavior, consumer demands, and obviously the changing aspect of what consumers are looking at from products and services. And in those cases, that could pose, social risk. Technological risks for large companies, bank, financial institutions could be, say, for example, cybersecurity, wherein attacks or cyber attacks, if they are done on the website to bring the site down or to, disable the services, could be technological risks which the companies could face, and they could be analyzed best with PESTEL analysis. Internal risks or micro risks, micro factors which can affect the company's operations could be, analyzed through SWOT analysis. And these could be, for example, areas wherein the business and the factors which are affecting the business in terms of risks, which are more or less internal to the organization. So things like, the ability to be able to, say, for example, look at building a brand or leveraging your brand against the economic downturn. There were certain companies or certain products and services which even during lockdown did not slow down in terms of their business and business activities. And that was down to the fact that people still trusted the brand. And obviously, in those cases, the business, if not, it continued, but if not booming, then it continued. Similarly, you could look at, things like weaknesses. If the company is not budgeted for, say, for example, on its website, have not put proper measures in place to avoid any cyber attacks, that could be seen as a weakness. Opportunities could be company looking at, similar, gave an example earlier of pharmaceutical company not looking at, expanding to a market because of legislation or tougher controls or because of competition. Here, you could look at that as an opportunity wherein a pharmaceutical company would want to expand into a market because that's a native market wherein there is no competition or lesser legislation or regulatory control. And these could be frameworks which could be used primarily to detect risks, internal or external to the organization. So just a summary table here to identify how these two frameworks, PEST and SWOT, can be used by the organization to do contingency planning with regards to risk management. Now we come to the second last part of the discussion in this learning outcome, which is how do we use risk as identification and mapping to support assessment and prioritization of responses. Now, a simple example would be that a lot of countries, because of global changes in the climate, are facing floods. Now, if I look at the government's position, there are, say, for example, in the Indian context, there are a couple of states which are currently under, facing severe flood situations. Now, if the government has to look at, giving a response in terms of which place, which state it deploys most of its resources, they at some stage, when I say they, I mean the management or the government department at some stage would need to sit down and prioritize where they would need to provide more rescue efforts, more equipment, and put more focus in order to, save people, or in order to basically deal with that situation. And this particular bit tends to be, looking at identification of risk and then looking at how do we provide support. Obviously, there are 8-9 states under flood conditions right now, and they would need to respond to all these states. But what at some stage they will do is, because they have finite resources, and in order to provide, immediate action, they would need to focus on which states where the situation is very critical, and that is where the infrastructure or the government machinery and help would be essentially deployed. So if the government has to look at this as a process of, supporting the members of public and obviously the states, they would look at doing risk identification, mapping, prioritization of risk, and then again, the same process being followed, which is to identify and control to ensure that there is less loss of life or less disruption to day-to-day operations, and in some cases, less loss of, let's say, reduce the loss of infrastructure, which is where they would need to invest again to build that, to bring it back to the original terms before the floods or before the monsoon season or floods affected these states. So in this case also, we look at basically identification, avoidance, we look at transfer, and we look at acceptance. So floods have happened. The governments have to accept that it is caused widespread damage. But what they now need to do is basically focus on efforts in terms of reducing losses which are occurring to farms, let's say crop, animals, people in general, and the infrastructure. And that is where they would need to prioritize, by looking at identifying the risk and then looking at prioritization of response in terms of resources to deal with this current situation of flooding in different states in the Indian context. Now, there are certain theoretical frameworks which primarily, are used when we talk about, dealing with risk and prioritization of risk. Now, one of the frameworks that we use is the COSO framework. COSO framework is basically a foundation of the internal controls and fraud deterrence. Now, this is mostly related to financial side of things, but basically helps in enterprise risk management, and is one of the frameworks which is widely used, because it was developed by the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, and the COSO framework is now, pretty much employed as a comprehensive tool that assists organization in managing risk, enhancing control processes, and achieving the objectives of minimizing loss, or, let's put it this way, minimizing loss and dealing with risk, comfortably. Now, this is a part of the corporate governance tool, and it is used as one of the risk management techniques to be able to ensure that the valuable resources of business do not, get impacted in the long term, in order to manage, in uncertainties or risks which the organization are essentially facing. Now, this particular framework, if I bring this across, is basically based on, 3 pillars, which is operations, reporting, and compliance. But when we look at what kind of activities it helps to, deter or do away with, it starts with monitoring activities. It looks at communication and information, it looks at controlling, it looks at risk assessment, and it also looks at controlling the environment in which these risks can essentially occur. Now, this was basically created as a framework in the 1980s, and it is used, when I say COSO framework, it is basically an acronym for Committees of Sponsoring Organization. And this committee and a framework was put together and accepted globally in 1992. And then, what it basically does, it has undergone a bit of an update from time to time, but there are 5 essential components of it which are highlighted here: control, environment, risk assessment, control activities, information, communication, and monitoring activities. And this is a framework which is basically used heavily by companies which are trading on the stock exchange, publicly traded companies, wherein you are looking at large firms for which they need to be held accountable in terms of their, let's say, resources and the financial side of financial results. So this framework puts a lot of internal controls that help the business formalize its activities in a way wherein they can be audited. They can also be looking at meeting ethical and legal requirements. And at the same time, they're focused on ensuring that there is proper risk management processes in place which allow the business to, continuously function within the set of competitive environment which it is running. And it is a framework which is primarily used for, purposes of ensuring audit and control, within organizations, specifically from a financial point of view. And that is why, this framework has become important, specifically when we talk about public traded companies, accounting firms, and financial services firms, because it is an audit tool which helps auditors to monitor the adherence of standards, financial standards in particular, and the, let's say, the adherence of these financial standards by the organization, to see what regular, let's say, what controls the business has in place to ensure that these standards do not essentially slip. The other is decision theory. And when we talk about decision theory, in the decision theory, we talk about, essentially the, if I put it this way, there are 2 different theories: decision theory and game theory. So when we talk about decision theory, what we are essentially looking at is, an approach that is normally applied primarily by, let's say, I'll rephrase that. It's a theory which basically looks at probability, and then applies the probability in terms of what would be the probability of this decision going right or this decision benefiting the organization. So it is basically a model or a theory which basically is applied primarily to look at decisions and the probability of these decisions being correct. So it's a Bayesian approach. Decision theory is primarily a Bayesian approach, and it is concerned primarily with identifying the values and uncertainties the business can face in a particular area, and then how these can then be, let's say, further optimized or minimized from a point of view of risk perspective. So logic and probability in this case is applied by gathering information and then identifying and assessing risks, and that is then used for making decisions at the management level. And that would be the process of using decision theory when faced with problems, or when organization faces problems at the operational level, at the tactical level, or at the strategic level. Now, there are, I think best is to understand this by using an example. So when we talk about, say, for example, different theories, and we talk about, different examples of how this would be useful in identifying risks. So what we would look at is say, for example, the cybersecurity as a risk, for example, for the organization. Sometimes if I look at an organization like a bank here, Cybersecurity could be a high risk because it's a banking institution. There could be, if there is a hack which is to happen in the bank website, codes, addresses, details could be taken or stolen. And if this kind of an attack happens, then the impact could be far-reaching, because customer details, if stolen, can be then reused online to be able to do financial fraud. So here, if the risk is to be identified in banking institutions, there what you are going to look at is it has a very highly likelihood of cyber attack. It has the impact which is going to be at the highest level. So priority to manage this impact, if there is an attack to happen, then the website needs to be secure. And in this case, the IT team would need to look at risk reduction by employing tools and techniques which will allow its infrastructure to be robustly able to meet that particular threat. And that would be an example of how you would apply, for example, deal with, for example, risk which is at the enterprise level or at the company, organization-wide level. Then you look at economic downturn and you look at staff turnover. So staff turnover could be a low likelihood that a lot of people leave the organization. Impact could be medium term, because if we do see a continuous exodus happening within the organization, that would mean depletion of manpower within the organization. It could also mean depletion of talent within the organization. And although you might not see that impact immediately, but in the short term you would not see that impact, but in the long term or mid to long term, you would see a bit impact happening on the output of the organization or revenue, or the ability to grasp more revenue for the organization. And that would be termed as a risk, wherein the management would need to look at decision-based theory to try and mitigate and take decisions to set alternatives in place, like recruitment strategies, and ensure that there is enough manpower in the business to be able to carry out the operations. And here they would need to accept that risk, because people eventually can leave the organization because of very many different reasons. And this risk the organizations need to accept and better plan so that it leads to lesser disruption as far as the workings of the organization is concerned. Any questions on this so far?
No, sir.
Okay. The last bit that we are looking at in today's learning outcome is we are looking at basically understanding how does risk and risk management affect stakeholders' expectation. So who are the stakeholders in the organization? The stakeholders in the organization could be employees, investors, banks. It could be suppliers. It could be third parties. They are basically stakeholders in the business or in organizations. And what is their expectation of how the organization deals with risk? In particularly, we are looking at investors, suppliers, and customers. Now, that is where we need to look at understanding two theories. Again, one is stakeholders theory, and we need to look at understanding the agency theory. Now, when we look at these two in particular, they would help us in understanding what are the what is stakeholder analysis, and then in terms of understanding, what is their expectation in terms of, how the organization can or should be dealing with risks if it is to face uncertain situations. Now, when we talk about stakeholder analysis is a process through which we are able to identify people who can have a meaningful impact in the workings of the organization. Stakeholder analysis essentially is a very established framework, and this framework basically talks about 3 or 4 different aspects of how essentially you would generally deal with stakeholder management, or identifying the needs and requirements of or interest of different stakeholders within the organization. Now, stakeholder analysis is used primarily to understand the interest of the key stakeholders in the organization, how they influence the decision-making process of the organization, and in this case, how would they be looking at helping to formulate any sort of strategies which the organization needs to put in place to deal with risks that it could face from competition, markets, system, people, processes, or external events. Now, when we talk about the stakeholder analysis and obviously how this can affect the organization, we need to look at, say, for example, a particular chart, or say, I would say, look at a particular aspect which would allow us to understand from a point of view of what their interests are. Now, when we talk about these in detail, there is something called a stakeholder power interest matrix. And that particular matrix allows us to understand stakeholder analysis, from an organizational perspective. So one of the things which I want to bring across is that when you look at stakeholders from a company's perspective, there could be internal stakeholders like employees, shareholders, suppliers, and customers, and then how the external factors affect the organization. It could be media, government, consumer groups, and competitors. Now, when I look at this and I bring the stakeholder analysis theory into for the purposes of managing stakeholder interests, what I would look at is this particular matrix, which is called the stakeholder power interest matrix. Now, this particular matrix actually helps us understand various aspects of how different stakeholders would be looking at the outcome or have an interest within the organization. So the power interest grid can be used to map different levels of interest of different stakeholders that are there for the organization and their involvement in the operations of the organization. Now, this matrix helps us understand whether we need to look at, let's say, it will help me decide, let me put it this way, that whether I would like to be a stakeholder which will invest in the company, or whether I would like to be a stakeholder which will have, which will only keep me informed on certain activities which are happening in the organization. And at a certain stage, I would like to actively engage because my interests or my stakes in the organization are quite high. And in some cases, my stakes in the organization are quite low. So when we look at these in particular, we can classify the interest of the stakeholders on a XY grid, and they would be high to low. And we would look at two aspects of it, which is power and interest. And this is where the name originates from, stakeholder power interest matrix. So if I'm a shareholder in the company, then my interest in the company driving profits, and at the end of the year, what dividends I would get would be more of importance to me rather than the day-to-day operations of the organization. On the other hand, if I'm an employee or employee of the organization, my interest is going to be to ensure it's going to be quite high to ensure that the company is able to deliver on its objectives, and at the end of the day, I'm getting paid for my services that I'm rendering to the organization. So my interest is going to be high, and my stakes are also going to be high, because if the company does not make profit, or if the company is not making enough profit, then my salary, my bonus, and other things would be affected in terms of the payouts from the organization. So similarly, we can look at doing the analysis of various stakeholders using the stakeholder theory, and that would allow me to understand whether that stakeholder has a high interest in terms of stakes within the organization, or whether it has low interest in terms of stakes within the organization. On the other hand, when we talk about agency theory, the agency theory, so I'll provide a bit of a handout on these theoretical frameworks because they will be useful from a point of view of understanding the theoretical frameworks. But what we need to do is basically look at the implication of these while we look at taking operational decisions or making operational decisions within the organization. Now, the agency theory explores how the interests of owners and managers align with the vision and mission of the organization. So here, sometimes when you look at working within an organization wherein the founder owner or the founder is also the director, or the part and parcel of the organization, or the top brass of the organization, there, in order to differentiate between the interests of the owner as well as the chief executive of the organization, needs to be established. And that is where we use agency theory to explore what are the interests and how they align when we look at two roles being taken up by the same person, and if there are any conflicts of interest in those particular roles, if that person is actually executing. And then I put one or two slides in to basically explain the stakeholder analysis from a point of view of investors, suppliers, customers, because that is what we need to look at in detail, specifically for the indicative content and the learning outcome. So when we look at three factors, risk tolerance, expectation, and impact, that is where we are going to use the stakeholder power interest grid or matrix to understand that if I'm an investor in the organization, what is the risk tolerance I have, what is the expectation I have from the organization, and how will it impact me in particular, and my interest in particular is what I would look at from the point of view of stakeholder analysis. Similarly, if you're a supplier, you would be looking at risk sharing, expectation, and impact. So how often do you ensure that your risks assessments are done in order to ensure that there are no disruptions in the supply chain? How do your suppliers, what are their expectations, and how do you deal with your suppliers in terms of payouts or payments, essentially to ensure that they are also able to be, their business activities are also viable, and they are continuing to then work and support, your supply chain from a point of view of ensuring the availability of raw material or goods or services that you buy from them. And similarly, we look at customers. In terms of customers may have sensitivity towards several types of risks, and these could include, for example, if Apple brings out a particular product and that product develops a lot of faults. Now, what is the sensitivity of the customer to be able to deal with that fault and obviously accept that fault? So if we see the initial versions of the iPhone, the 2.5, 3G, 3GS, 4, there were a lot of software glitches in the software, and Apple used to quickly fix them in a couple of days through the iOS system to make sure that the hardware keeps functioning. And customers became a bit sensitive or adjusted to the exceptions that these updates, these faults could occur, and they were software updates as well as they were basically software glitches, and they could be easily accommodated or resolved through software updates rather than being hardware failures. And in some cases, this sensitivity of customers being able to accept risks when buying and paying for a premium product like an Apple iPhone, allows the company to be more confident in terms of managing those risks and planning to manage those, or look at putting planning in place to manage those risks. So here, the customer's expectation is that the products that they buy should be reliable and should be value for money. Now, if they are not, then they expect the product to be replaced by the company, and that is what Apple does. So if there were customers which are unhappy with the product and wanted a refund, they were able to then process the refund for the customer in order to ensure that they are able to meet that expectation from a point of view of quality and reliability, and then not have an impact or a negative impact on their reputation. So what we need to be able to do is understand these impacts which the stakeholders can have, and what is the risk and the concern that they have on the risks, and how they expect the company to look at mitigating those risks. And that is what I've summarized in this particular table. So investors normally look at or don't like financial volatility because they are expecting at the end of the year dividends and returns, and companies to make profits, which will allow them to get higher yields on shares or return on investment that they have done in terms as an investor in the organization. And obviously their mitigation strategy is, if they don't feel the company is doing well or growing or is able to make a significant dent in the market, that sometimes you see that investors basically look at diversification. They start selling the shares, they look at diversifying, they say, okay, this particular company is not going to cut it, and obviously shareholders would then, or investors and shareholders would look at, obviously look at a diversification in terms of hedging their risks and start investing elsewhere by cashing out on when they can in terms of the companies or the incomes of the investment that they've made in the company. Suppliers, you will look at operational delays. If there are risks which the suppliers can pose to a company, and that would be operational delays, sometimes delays in supply chain or in terms of supply of products and resources or raw material which the company is buying, can lead to delays. And these delays would basically look at slowing down the manufacturing process, or maybe looking at creating shortage of inventory in the market for that company. So what companies would then look at doing is having dual sourcing, or they will have a contingency plan in place to ensure that if this supplier falters, they have multiple suppliers to be able to buy or source those products. And from a customer's point of view, they expect, value for money in terms of reputational, they want reliability and value for money for the products they buy. And in terms, if there is a bit of a risk, which could happen is sometimes when you look at the iPhone and the iCloud and, some of the services that we use today because of, iCloud or, cloud-based services, one of the concerns that customers have is basically related to their security of data. Now, if this is managed and there is no vulnerability in terms of managing that data, customers obviously continue using those services. And in order to mitigate risks, what companies like Dropbox or, like Google or any other company which basically looks at data storage and, managing customers' data, they would look at then employing, enhanced measures to control or, diffuse any sort of attack which can happen, cybersecurity attacks which can happen, which would mean that the data is secure and customers feel that they have, they can rely on the company or the brand and they continue using the services. So here, the idea of the study of stakeholder analysis and expectation is to look at a relationship between the stakeholders, the type of risk, and how this risk in particular can be managed for investors, suppliers, and customers when companies are dealing and having risk management as a strategy to deal with systems, processes, people, and external sources which could pose threat to the operational side of business activities of an organization. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far?
No, sir.
Okay. So this learning outcome we have completed in detail, and this should allow us to now complete the unit. Tomorrow's discussion that we're going to have primarily is going to be on the assignment brief and looking at how do we could put together an assignment, both assignment 1 and assignment 2, so that you're able to then complete, this particular unit. So the assignment briefs, I think, are on the, Moodle already. And what we are going to do is do a discussion on the creation of evidence and how do we look at, submitting the assignment for this unit.
Okay, sir.
Okay. See you tomorrow. Thanks for joining. Bye for now.
Thank you.